Hello, this is Fred Haight. Welcome to part 3 of What is Classical, produced for the Foundation for the Revival of Classical Culture. Today we're going to continue on the subject of polyphony with the special attention continuing on the case of canons, which in a way are the bedrock of polyphony. You may recall from last time the special attention that Joseph Haydn gave to his canons. He had about 50 of them framed and hung on his wall over his piano. There's a photograph of them there in his the museum that was formerly his home in Vienna. I promised last time that during this session I would discuss why these canons might be so important to Haydn, and suggested that a canon, even an elementary canon, may contain an elementary discovery, a polyphonic discovery, that, as elementary as it is, forms the basis for the elaboration later of a complete composition, much larger composition. An idea in music, though it may seem to be represented by a motif, a simple 3 or 4 note motif, such as da 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 da, because that's what you hear repeating, an idea in music is much more likely to be a polyphonic idea because it involves the play between voices and the potential for irony that exists in that play. It gives you somewhere to go, whereas any statement of 3 or 4 notes tends not to. As a young man, Beethoven was once a student of Haydn. Towards the end of his life, in the 1820s, when he was working on his late string quartets, Beethoven composed the following canon very quickly while with friends. The words are very simple in German. They say, es muss sein, which means it must be, it must be. Ja, 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 ja. I think we can all agree that that means yes, 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 yes. Heraus mit dem Beutel. Out with your wallet. Get out your wallet. Es muss sein, it must be. I probably shouldn't be singing it, but I couldn't find any satisfactory recordings, so I am. First, as a single line of music. Es muss sein, ja, 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 es muss sein, ja, 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 es muss sein, ja, 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 heraus mit dem Beutel, heraus, heraus, es muss sein, ja, 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 es muss sein. And then in 4 voices, hopefully. Es muss sein, ja, 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 es muss sein, ja, 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 ja. Ay, ay, ay. Well, I don't want to be too literal about assigning meanings to either this canon or the string quartet that later clearly relates to it, because you're dealing with the creative process. And when you're dealing with the creative process, especially with a genius like Beethoven, it's the product of a sovereign mind, and it goes on in his own mind, and we may never know many of the steps that were actually taken to go from one to another. But there are some things that we do know. One is that there is a story surrounding this canon that Beethoven was having some good-natured fun poking at a friend of his who had managed to get into one of his concerts without paying. We do know from reading that Beethoven all of his life had to fight to actually collect the money that was due to him. People neglected to do it or forgot about it or whatever it was, but it was his only source of livelihood, and he had to make a case about getting paid. That's a story that a lot of musicians know. That, however, does not explain the rather extraordinary use that Beethoven makes of this idea in his string quartet, Opus 135. This was the last work that Beethoven completed before he died, and the theme is used in the 4th movement, the last movement of the last work. Most artists present their works as a finished product with very little insight into the discoveries that took place that made it possible. Beethoven shares his creative discoveries, the creative process, with his audience in a way that almost No other artist does. Friedrich Schiller is really the only one that I can think of. This movement begins with what you see on the screen here. It consists of a title and then a few notes with text underneath them. What's most amazing about it is that it is not meant to be played. The actual movement begins on the next line down. This is here for the edification of the players and you, the audience, to help you understand what this piece is really all about. The title, Der schwer gefasste Entschluss, means it's translated either as the heavy, weighty decision or the difficult resolution. The first three notes of music come under the indication grave, which can mean both very slow and very serious, and the words muss es sein with a question mark after it. Must it be? The next two measures, he changes the clef to the treble clef, the key signature to F, and the tempo to allegro, and the words are es muss sein, es muss sein. It must be, it must be. So the second part, es muss sein, it must be, is in the same key as the canon, and the notes are identical to the opening of the canon. Es muss sein, es muss sein. The opening poses the question, must it be? Muss es sein. What's remarkable is that these two phrases, like a question and answer, are inversions of one another. I said earlier that a musical idea is essentially a polyphonic idea, and inversion is an important part of polyphony, an important part of generating such ideas for a composer. And in its simplest form, inversion is simply standing things on their head, turning them upside down, making the notes go down by the same degree they went up, or vice versa. For instance, if you look at es muss sein, that is up by a minor third, A to C, and then down by a perfect fourth. So up by a minor third, down by a perfect fourth. If the question muss es sein was exactly the same, then it would go like this. Minor third down, perfect fourth up. That would be a strict inversion of es muss sein, but that obviously doesn't do what Beethoven wants. So he alters a bit by a half tone, and it descends by a diminished fourth instead of a perfect fourth. Muss es sein. But that's close enough that it's pretty clear in my mind that Beethoven saw these two phrases as not only question and answer, but inversions of one another. Because this turned out to be Beethoven's last completed work before he died, many people have analyzed this work by saying, well, the heavy question is his own mortality, and must it be refers to do I have to die? Am I ready to die? And that the inversion of it finds a positive solution in the meaning of life. We'll come back to that, but let's listen at first to how this drama unfolds, because it's not just 6 notes. Muss es sein, the question, repeats itself several times, and it's quite a struggle until it suddenly flips over into a very happy and joyful es muss sein, it must be. about Beethoven resolving the question of facing his own mortality? Or is this Beethoven pulling our legs? Beethoven was a great leg puller, and the title, The Difficult Resolution, could be a joke upon a musical resolution, resolving a dissonance into a consonance, such as you see implied by the 9 notes here. Although the very form of stating it also indicates that it's not your typical textbook resolution. The movement rolls along happily for long enough that we've just about pretty much forgotten about that grave introduction, when suddenly Beethoven brings it back, and it's even more dissonant and disturbing than before, and Es muss sein does not just simply pop up on the scene as a happy resolution, it has to struggle. Coming back to this question of whether it could be both dead serious and lighthearted at the same time, Friedrich Schiller, the poet of freedom, insisted that part of the mission of great art was that our intellects educate our emotions and our emotions educate our intellects, so that we are able to broaden the scope of what we take into our hearts and minds, so that rather than recoil in fear from events in the world that frighten us, we embrace them because we have an idea that we can do something about them. That if we are enjoying a good laugh, we don't see the introduction of something serious as a bummer that spoils the mood. And conversely, if we're having a serious discussion, we don't see someone cracking a joke as lessening the seriousness of that discussion. Do the fool's very funny moments in Shakespeare's King Lear lessen the seriousness of it? Or maybe even increase it? Does the humor give our minds enough space to be free to deal with the horrors? Such an aesthetic state, as described by Schiller, requires an emotional and intellectual integration. We should be able to move from dead serious matters to lighthearted and humorous ones without losing a beat, and then move back to serious ones without losing a beat, because our minds are one integrated whole. We don't have two personalities that reacts to different things in different ways. But there is another aspect and more profound aspect to this question of integrating the serious and the lighthearted. Don't just look at inversion as a mechanical process of turning the notes upside down. Look at the metaphorical aspects of it as turning the question upside down. Take what seems to be a liability and turn it into an asset. Instead of being depressed about the fact that life is short, you're born, you don't live that long, and then you're going to die, see it as wisdom, because that forces you to look at your life in a certain way. You've got a certain number of years in order to do something good that's going to live on after you. If we lived forever, would we ever think about that? Would we ever bother to do that? How many thousand times might we say, oh well, There will always be another chance. The knowledge that we have a finite amount of time to do something which gives our lives meaning long after we're dead inspires us to do things that do exactly that, whether it be having a family to perpetuate our values or, like a great artist or scientist, making discoveries that directly affect people's lives for generations to come. This loving idea of goodness, of something contributed to the future, is also something shared between great artists and scientists. As a young boy, the composer Felix Mendelssohn admired the late Beethoven, cherished his works, even though they never met, they were too far apart. And Mendelssohn would play piano reductions of his string quartets for anyone who would listen, but mostly met with a dumbfounded lack of understanding, even his own father. When Beethoven died in 1827, the young 18-year-old boy Mendelssohn felt a great sense of loss, not just for himself, but for the world. He responded by composing one of his greatest works, his string quartet in A minor. It's only his second string quartet, but it's dedicated to Beethoven. There's no words that say it's dedicated to Beethoven, but I can point out to you at least 3 different Beethoven quartets, late Beethoven quartets, that it quotes poignantly and intensely. After a slow introduction, the first movement of Mendelssohn's quartet features a 3-note theme. Let's listen to it. You may notice a resemblance to the 3 notes of the opening of Beethoven's 4th movement of Opus 135. Mendelssohn was quoting a song that he had written a few months earlier, Frage, or question, which begins with the words, Ist es wahr? Is it true?
Ist es wahr? Ist es wahr?
Now, 2 sets of 3 notes that form a question have words attached. Mendelssohn's Ist es wahr? Is it true? And Beethoven's Muss es sein? Must it be? Mendelssohn began this string quartet with a slow introduction that then settles in on exactly that theme. To this day, the attribution of the poem that Mendelssohn set as Frage is to a poet named Voss. It was a revelation to me to read that his nephew later wrote, no, Mendelssohn wrote both the words and the music for that poem in June of 1827. That places it a little over 2 months after the death of Beethoven. That suggests to me that Mendelssohn was not merely taking something that he had written earlier for a different reason and applying it to Beethoven, but rather that he was taking his first memorial to the master, perhaps comparable to setting some flowers beside his grave, and then taking the time to expand that into a full-blown monument, a string quartet, composed in the months following the setting of the song in June of 1827. But since Mendelssohn had composed his own poem for this song, a little more than 2 months after Beethoven had died, perhaps we might learn something from examining Mendelssohn's own poem. In translation, is it true? Is it true that over there, in the leafy walkway, You always wait for me by the vine-draped wall, and that with the moonlight and the little stars you consult about me too? Is it true? Speak. What I feel, only you grasp. You who feel with me and stays ever faithful to me, eternally faithful. That is of a sublime beauty and shows an emotion and intellectual commitment rare for an 18-year-old, but it fits with the best of classical art and what I quoted from Schiller before about our intellects educating our emotions and our emotions educating our intellect. How many 18-year-olds do you know today who could summon that amount of intellectual and emotional maturity? Alma comes close at only 13. Mendelssohn's sister, Fanny, did, but it was an age in which women were just simply not allowed to do that. That type of emotional and intellectual maturity belongs properly to classical art if classical art is allowed to rise to the levels that Schiller demanded of it. The fourth movement of Mendelssohn's quartet breaks every rule of form. It's a rousing presto, as is appropriate, very fast, but then after quoting several sections of Beethoven, slows down to an adagio, a slow movement, and ends by going back to this quote. Ist es wahr? Is it true? Is it true that Beethoven has died, that he's gone? The entire quartet is beautiful and worth your study, but for now I will end the way Mendelssohn ends, with the return to Ist es wahr? Is it true? That would be a fitting enough end to this presentation, and I think in a future session I will take up the more elaborated question of the relationship of this quartet by Mendelssohn to the late quartets of Beethoven. Well, for now, I wish to end the way that Beethoven ended. Although I do believe that his creative process existed on multiple levels and you have to look at them all, I also do believe that he was dealing with the question of mortality and found a joyful solution to that in the meaning of his own life. And although he did not know this was going to be his last completed work, what a fitting ending. When you have to go, when it's your time to leave, do you want to go like Dylan Thomas and say, "Do not go gently against that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light"? Or do you want to go like this?